Okay, this is going to be a little bit of a weird one. So I managed to spill a whole bunch of coffee on my laptop, so this is what you get today for a lecture. Today we're going to be talking about viruses and bacteria. Viruses are non-living pathogens, like we talked about. We could say that they are acellular. A couple definitions to get us started. All viruses have a capsid. A capsid it's the outer shell, it's the shell of a virus. It's made out of proteins, and some viruses also have an envelope. This is an enclosing structure, usually a phospholipid bilayer membrane, and it helps protect the virus. The envelope is usually formed by the virus sort of taking with it some of the cell membrane of the host cell when it bursts, during that part of the viral life cycle. Now, just a couple other facts about viruses to get us started. Some viruses use RNA, while others use DNA. This is the primary way that we classify viruses. The word virus itself comes from the Latin word for poison or slimy substance, which is kind of funny. And there are viruses that infect animals, bacteria, plants, fungi. There are even viruses that infect other viruses. So viruses can get pretty weird. Viruses have come in four primary shapes. Let's see if I can get all this in at once. So shapes of viruses. They come in four primary shapes. These are filamentous, isometric, enveloped, and head and tail. Let's start with filamentous. Filamentous. These are long, stringy virus shapes. If you Google the Ebola virus, this is what you'll see. This is the typical filamentous virus for humans. They're called filamentous because they look like a filament, right? Like a filament in a light bulb, right? It sort of goes, although we're all using LEDs now, but whatever. Filamentous viruses actually tend to primarily be viruses that infect plants. Isometric viruses have this sort of isometric shape, sort of like spherical, but if you made spherical with a bunch of edges, so polyhedral is the fancy word for this. They can also be called icosahedral viruses, or the shape can be called icosahedral. They're classified based on their shape, and examples of this are things like herpes and polio. So these are non-enveloped isometric, so they don't have an envelope, but they do have this sort of general shape. Next up is enveloped viruses. These have a lipid bilayer. This protects them. Again, usually has glycoproteins embedded. So the glycoproteins, these are proteins that have some sort of carbohydrate attached to them. They're involved in signaling and all sorts of other stuff. Our example here is SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that is causing the COVID-19 disease. So this is like a real Frankenstein's. This is like biology's version of like it's Frankenstein's monster, right? But so the Frankenstein is the name of the guy that made it, not that made the monster. The monster is not named Frankenstein. It's Dr. Frankenstein made it. So the virus that causes COVID-19 is called SARS, Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome -CoV coronavirus 2, because it's the second one. The SARS virus that was in 2002, the SARS outbreak of 2002, was SARS-CoV-1. Finally, we have head and tail viruses. These are sort of the most complex shape. Our example here is bacteriophages. So these are viruses that infect bacteria. So these are the four primary shapes of viruses. Again, there's probably some other viruses out there that are weird shapes because nature's full of all sorts of weird shit. But here we have the four primary shapes of viruses. And these are the first of the types of things that can cause, the first types of pathogens, right? So I said that at the very start, I said that viruses are non-living pathogens. Pathogen is just something that causes a disease. The other type of pathogens that we can get infected by are bacteria. So there are three main types or shapes of bacteria. These are coccus, Bacillus, and there's a other category. I didn't draw the shape here. Do I have a? See if I can do this with one hand. So, but it's sort of. So the types of bacteria, we define bacteria broadly by their shapes. So coccus or cockle bacteria, these are spherical bacteria. Our example here would be streptococcus. This is what gives you strep throat. If you have a staph infection, that's staphylococcus. Staphylococcus aureus, pneumonia is also a cockle bacteria. So they can be sort of single cells. They can grow in these strings or filaments. They can grow in these grape-like clusters. Next up is bacillus. Bacillus bacteria are rod-shaped. So you may, lactobacillus, you may have heard of. Lactobacillus is a bacteria that digests milk, and these can grow in chains, and they can also grow in these are called palisades. You see these less often, I believe, but generally these tend to grow in strings. Then finally we have, there are other shapes, sort of like the broad other shape category, but the most common of the other shapes is spirillum, which is still fairly uncommon. There's very few actually that have the name spirillum in their genus or anything. There's Spirillum winogradsky, which is the only one there's two I've ever been in. I think there might be two total. One of them is Spirillum winogradsky. I don't remember what the other one is off the top of my head. These are spirally. They're sort of little spirals, like the name might imply. So these are the three types of bacteria, and we can identify their basic type based on what their shape is. Last slide is bacterial groups. So bacteria can grow. So generally we classify, broadly we classify cells as unicellular or multicellular, right? So unicellular or multicellular. Unicellular can also, has a subgroup, which is colonial. Colonial bacteria form colonies. They form groups. So not all bacteria do this, or not all single-celled organisms do this, but the difference between a colonial group of cells versus a multicellular group of cells is that if you were to take your liver out of your body, your liver wouldn't just be able to be chill on its own. It wouldn't grow on its own. Whereas if you break a colony in half, if you cut a colony, if you take part of a colony and you put it somewhere else, it would just keep growing and make a new colony. Sorry about that beep. I don't know what beeps down here in my basement. So bacteria, they're all single-celled organisms, but many of them grow in colonies. We can we can describe these colonies. We have fancy-ass words to describe these shapes of colonies based on what they are. So we have these colonies can either be in clusters or strings. So the prefix staph or staphylo, this is what tells us that the bacteria grows in sort of, you hear them called a lot grape-like clusters, but clumps, right? So our example here would be staphylococcus. Whereas strepto, bacteria that have the prefix strepto, these are either like streptococcus, streptobacillus. These grow in long chains. So that is it for today. There'll be a fun, weird little assignment up on Canvas. So go ahead and check that out, and have a good one.